Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are walking through a California bar exam torts question. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today we're walking through a torts question from the February 2016 exam. This is also part of our series of podcasts talking about how to approach questions on the California bar exam. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any upcoming essay discussions. When you see a torts essay on the exam, be sure to focus on issue spotting. Potential torts in each fact pattern are numerous. By making sure you spot them all, you can impress the bar exam graders and pick up easy points. Focus on issue spotting as you parse the language in each sentence of the fact pattern, and then make sure you've listed each tort in your outline so that you don't forget any. Before we walk through today's question, we need to do a quick review of the law you will want to know for this question. A person is liable for intentional torts when the person has both the intent to act and the intent to achieve certain results from those actions. Even someone who is delusional can still be found guilty of an intentional tort when he intended to act and intended to achieve certain results from those actions. Assault is the intent to create apprehension in another of immediate bodily harm. Apprehension means that the victim must be aware of the threat against him or her. Threatening words alone do not amount to assault. Intentional infliction of emotional distress is when the defendant commits outrageous conduct that causes the plaintiff severe distress. Battery is the intentional infliction of bodily harm caused by harmful or offensive touching of another's person. Another's person includes objects connected to a person, such as a purse. A person may use reasonable force in defense of another when that person believes that the other is in danger of immediate bodily harm. The force used must be proportionate to the threat. Mistaken self-defense or defense of others is still a valid defense to an intentional tort so long as the mistake was reasonable. Trespass to land happens when the defendant unlawfully enters plaintiff's land. Trespass to chattel and conversion are property torts that happen when the defendant damages or steals the property of a plaintiff. The difference between trespass to chattel and conversion is one of degree. Trespass to chattel occurs when the property is harmed but not completely destroyed, and conversion occurs when the property is completely destroyed or taken. Under the doctrine of transferred intent, the intent to commit an intentional tort against one plaintiff may be transferred to another plaintiff if the second plaintiff is actually harmed. Okay, now let's move on to reading the bar exam question. This question is from the February 2016 bar exam. We will link to a webpage where you can find this question in the show notes. Here we go. Jack believed that extraterrestrial aliens had come to Earth, were living undercover as humans, and were planning a full-scale invasion in the future. Jack believed that his next-door neighbor, Nancy, was one of these aliens. One day, Nancy called Jack on the phone to complain that Jack's children were playing in her yard. Jack yelled that his children could play wherever they wanted to. He also said that he was going to kill her. The next day, Nancy approached Jack, who was playing in his yard with his children. She reminded him to keep his children out of her yard. Jack picked up a chainsaw and said, "When the invasion comes, I'm going to use this baby to cut off your head." From the other side of the street, Ben saw Jack angrily raise the chainsaw at Nancy. Ben ran across the street and knocked Jack to the ground and injured him. Later that week, Jack decided that he could wait no longer. He saw Nancy's car, which he believed to be an alien spaceship, parked on the street. He snuck over to her car and cut the brake lines, hoping that Nancy would have a minor accident and be taught a lesson. Unaware that her car had been tampered with, Nancy lent it to Paul. When the brakes failed to work, Paul drove off a mountain road and was severely injured. Number 1. What tort causes of action, if any, may Nancy bring against Jack, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. Number 2, what tort causes of action, if any, may Jack bring against Ben, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. And number 3, what torts action, if any, may Paul bring against Jack, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. Now, this question forces us to assess all of the torts causes of action between three parties: Nancy versus Jack, Jack versus Ben, and Paul versus Jack. When marking up your exam paper, make sure to keep in mind the relationship between each actor to keep your facts in order. This question also asks you to estimate how likely each cause of action is to fare. When analyzing each cause of action, be sure to argue both sides based on the facts provided. And at the end, come to a conclusion and state whether the cause of action would be likely to succeed or not, and then provide a quick reason why. In other words, state your conclusion, then follow it up with the all-important because. Some of the tort causes of actions that we will address will also be addressed in multiple sections for this essay. To save time, you can refer back to your rule statements from previous sections, noting, quote, "see above for rule." Now, the first thing you should do is mark up your exam paper to assess what is legally significant about each fact in the fact pattern. So, first, Jack believed that extraterrestrial aliens had come to Earth, were living undercover as humans, and were planning a full-scale invasion in the future. The fact that Jack believed aliens had come to Earth sets up the overarching issue of whether Jack can form the appropriate intent even though he was delusional. Next fact, Jack believed that his next-door neighbor, Nancy, was one of these aliens. Now, again, this fact goes to whether Jack can be convicted of any intentional torts he commits against Nancy. You'll want to note this fact during your analysis of any intentional torts in the Nancy versus Jack question. Next fact. One day, Nancy called Jack on the phone to complain that Jack's children were playing in her yard. Now, here we learned that this interaction between Nancy and Jack occurred over the phone and not in person, and this will impact our assault analysis, as discussed more below. Jack yelled that his children could play wherever they wanted to. He also said that he was going to kill her. Here, the facts tell us that Jack threatened to kill Nancy over the phone and was yelling when he said it. A threat to cause immediate bodily harm gives rise to a cause of action for assault. Key for our analysis here is that Jack made the threat over the phone and said that he was going to kill Nancy, meaning he was making a threat for some time in the future, and the threat was only verbal. Our next fact. The next day, Nancy approached Jack, who was playing in his yard with his children. She reminded him to keep his children out of her yard. Jack picked up a chainsaw and said, "When the invasion comes, I'm going to use this baby to cut off your head." With this statement, Jack is again threatening Nancy, prompting us to think about another assault analysis. This time, Nancy is near Jack, as she just approached him in his yard. Jack also picked up a chainsaw when threatening her. But note here that we have a similar problem with immediacy that we had with Jack threatening Nancy over the phone. Jack says he'll cut off Nancy's head when the invasion comes, meaning that his threat may not be immediate. Jack's statement and conduct is also far beyond the norm. When you see this type of outrageous conduct, think intentional infliction of emotional distress. The key fact missing for that portion of our analysis is something indicating whether it caused Nancy severe distress. Next fact. From the other side of the street, Ben saw Jack angrily raise a chainsaw at Nancy. With this, we're introduced to Ben. Before Ben approaches Jack, he sees Jack raise the chainsaw at Nancy. Ben has no other context for understanding Jack's motivations, what Jack said, or any other interactions between Jack and Nancy. Next fact. Ben ran across the street and knocked Jack to the ground and injured him. Here, Ben runs across the street and knocks Jack down. This physical interaction between Ben and Jack should bring Ben's liability for battery to the forefront of our minds. Ben ran across the street and knocked Jack to the ground and injured him. Here, Ben runs across the street and knocks Jack down. This physical interaction between Ben and Jack should bring Ben's liability for battery to the forefront of our minds. But we can't analyze this in isolation. Based on the preceding fact that Ben saw Jack raise the chainsaw, we can surmise that Ben thought that Nancy was in danger. So we should think about whether Ben can raise a defense based on the defense of others. A smaller issue here is also that Ben ran over and knocked Jack down, and Jack had been standing on his property. Jack could bring a trespass to land claim as a result. Next fact. Later that week, Jack decided that he could wait no longer. He saw Nancy's car, which he believed to be an alien spaceship, parked down the street. Now, the fact that Jack thought Nancy's car might be a spaceship, again, tests whether he could commit an intentional tort. Note this fact when discussing the intentional torts Jack could have committed when he cuts Nancy's car brake lines. Another interesting note from this fact is that Nancy's car was parked on the street, not on her property, so we don't have to worry about a lengthy trespass to land analysis here. Next fact. He snuck over to her car and cut the brake lines, hoping Nancy would have a minor accident and would be taught a lesson. Now, whenever you're reading a torts fact pattern and see anything done to someone else's movable property, think trespass to chattel and conversion. Based on his conduct, you will need to address both causes of action. Also note that Jack cuts the brakes, hoping that Nancy would have a minor accident and be taught a lesson. The hope that he'd injure Nancy when cutting the brakes is indicative of intent. Now, last fact. Unaware that the car had been tampered with, Nancy lent it to Paul. When the brakes failed to work, Paul drove off a mountain road and was severely injured. Now, instead of injuring Nancy, Jack's conduct ended up injuring Paul. When you see an intentional tort that ends up injuring someone else, this creates an issue of transferred intent. Because Jack cuts the brakes and ultimately injured Paul, we'll need to address in our analysis Jack's liability to Paul for battery under the doctrine of transferred intent. Now, this fact pattern may not look like it has much for us at first, but when you dig in, you can uncover the myriad potential tort causes of action between Nancy, Jack, and Ben. Be sure to keep track of all the possible causes of action by making notes in the margins as you read through the facts. Now let's look at how to actually answer this question. You would start any outline or answer by breaking your paper into at least one section for each of the 3 questions. Ideally, you would also segment your outline even further for each section for each tort that you're addressing. So number 1, what tort causes of action, if any, may Nancy bring against Jack, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. Number 2, what tort causes of action, if any, may Jack bring against Ben, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. And number 3, what tort causes of action, if any, may Paul bring against Jack, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. Before beginning to write, it's a good idea to form an idea of the likely conclusion for each cause of action. Remember, the question specifically requests that you assess how likely each cause of action will fare. Make sure that your analysis you write up supports the conclusion that you ultimately draw. Now let's look at each issue separately. Question number 1, what torts causes of action, if any, may Nancy bring against Jack? And how is each likely to fare? So our overarching issue number 1 is whether Jack can be found guilty of intentional torts. And our first rule is that a person is liable for intentional torts when the person has both the intent to act and the intent to achieve certain results from those actions. Jack believes that aliens come down to Earth and they were planning to invade, and that his neighbor was also an alien. Based on his state of mind, Jack will want to argue that he didn't actually intend to commit any torts. But as Nancy and Paul will contend, Jack did intend his actions to achieve certain things as a result of those actions. So here our conclusion is, because Jack intended his actions despite the fact that they were motivated by delusions, a court will likely find that Jack can be held liable for an intentional tort. Next issue, whether Jack assaulted Nancy when he threatened to kill her over the phone. Our rule here is that assault is the intent to create apprehension in another of immediate bodily harm. Apprehension means that the victim must be aware of the threat against him or her. Threatening words alone do not amount to assault. Now here, while on the phone with Nancy, Jack yelled and threatened that he would kill Nancy. Because they were on the phone, Nancy couldn't see any of Jack's conduct, so her assault claim is based on words alone. In addition, because they were on the phone and in separate houses, the threat of harm was not immediate. So our conclusion for this issue is that Nancy's cause of action against Jack for assault based on the threat during the phone call will likely fail because she can't demonstrate that she feared imminent bodily harm. So the next issue, whether Jack assaulted Nancy when he threatened her in his yard with the chainsaw. Our rule here is we can use the same rule for this issue as we did for the last issue because this is about assault. So we would just say, see above for rule. When Nancy approached Jack about keeping his kids off her lawn, he raised a chainsaw and yelled, "When the invasion comes, I'm going to use this baby to cut off your head." Jack's statement, coupled with raising the chainsaw to her, would create an apprehension of harm. However, assault requires apprehension of immediate harm, and Jack says that he'll do it when the invasion occurs. Those words set the stage for a future, not immediate threat of harm. Now, students can reach a conclusion either way with respect to this question. The importance is to draw a reasonable conclusion based on the analysis. A possible conclusion is that because Jack wasn't saying that the invasion had come, he was speaking of the future, not the present. So Nancy did not apprehend immediate bodily harm. All right, the next issue, whether Jack is liable to Nancy for intentional infliction of emotional distress for threatening to cut off Nancy's head with a chainsaw. IIED requires a defendant to commit outrageous conduct that causes severe distress in the plaintiff. Here, Jack's conduct was outrageous because he threatened to cut off Nancy's head and raised a chainsaw up to show how he could do it. But the rule also requires that Nancy suffer severe distress, which is required for her intentional infliction of emotional distress claim. So our conclusion is, as long as Nancy shows that she suffered emotional distress caused by Jack's conduct, she will likely prevail on an IIED claim. The next issue, whether Jack is liable to Nancy for trespass to chattel and or conversion for cutting her car brakes. Our rule here is trespass to chattel and conversion are property torts that occur when the defendant damages or steals the property of a plaintiff. The difference between trespass to chattel and conversion is one of degree. Trespass to chattel occurs where property is harmed but not completely destroyed, and conversion occurs when the property is destroyed or stolen. Here, Jack intentionally damaged Nancy's car when he cut its brakes. After Jack cut the brakes on the car was damaged even further because it caused Paul to drive off a mountain road. From that type of incident, we can surmise that the car was likely totally destroyed. So in conclusion, because Jack cut the brakes on Nancy's car and the car eventually fell off of a mountain road as a result, Nancy's claims for trespass to chattel and conversion will prevail. Now, our next question was, what tort causes of action, if any, may Jack bring against Ben, and how is each likely to fare? Here, our first issue is whether Jack has a claim for battery against Ben because Ben knocked Jack to the ground after seeing Jack raise the chainsaw at Nancy. Our rule here is that battery is the intentional infliction of bodily harm caused by harmful or offensive touching of another's person. Here, Ben intentionally harmed Jack when he knocked Jack to the ground, so Jack can make out a prima facie case for battery against Ben. But whether Ben has a defense against Jack's claim for battery because he reasonably believed he was protecting Nancy from Jack is our next issue. The rule here is that a person may use reasonable force in defense of another when that person believes that the other is in danger of immediate bodily harm. The force used must be proportionate to the threat. Here we have another sub-rule called mistaken self-defense or defense of others. This is still a valid defense to an intentional tort so long as the mistake was reasonable. So our analysis here is even though Jack has a prima facie case for battery against Ben, Ben can still assert the defense of another. Ben saw Nancy being threatened from across the road with a chainsaw. Based on this, he reasonably believed that Nancy was in danger of immediate bodily harm. Ben then knocked Jack over to prevent Nancy from being harmed and even possibly killed by the chainsaw. Based on the potential threat to Nancy, Ben's response was reasonable. So, because Ben was protecting Nancy from what he reasonably believed was Jack's threat with a chainsaw, Ben likely will not be found liable for battery. Our next issue is whether Jack can successfully assert a trespass to land cause of action against Ben. Our rule here is trespass to land occurs when the defendant unlawfully enters plaintiff's land. Here, Ben intentionally ran onto Jack's property to knock him down, but Ben will argue that he was justified in running on his property as a result of a public necessity. A public necessity creates an absolute privilege to enter the land of another, and here, Ben was helping Nancy, another community member, from the risk of being killed by Jack and his chainsaw. So because Ben can assert the defense of public necessity due to Jack's conduct, Jack is unlikely to prevail on a trespass to land cause of action. Question number 3. There's still more to go. What tort causes of action, if any, may Paul bring against Jack, and how is each likely to fare? Discuss. Now, whether Paul can bring a cause of action against Jack because Jack cut the brakes to Nancy's car. So the issue is whether Paul can bring a cause of action against Jack because Jack cut the brakes to Nancy's car, which Paul then borrowed. Under the doctrine of transferred intent, the intent to commit an intentional tort against one plaintiff may be transferred to another plaintiff if the harm actually befalls the second plaintiff. So here, when Jack cut the brakes on Nancy's car, he did so because he hoped that she would be injured. Based on this, he intended to commit battery against Nancy. Although his plan failed against Nancy, the harm he intended for Nancy actually did harm Paul. Nancy allowed Paul to borrow her car, and Paul then drove off the mountain road because the car brakes had been cut. So because Jack intended to batter Nancy and his action ultimately harmed Paul, Jack is likely liable to Paul under the doctrine of transferred intent. Now, that's it. Can you believe it? Torts essay questions are great for honing in on your issue spotting skills. In a typical torts question, you'll wind up with many causes of action. To target each, you need to go through the fact pattern line by line to make sure you don't miss anything. Enhancing this skill will not only serve you on future tort essay questions, but also essay questions in other substantive areas of the law. Another thing to think about is when you have a bunch of causes of action, the analysis is not going to be the same for each plaintiff and defendant and each issue. So even if you have two issues that are both dealing with, let's say, assault, think about how they're going to be different for each of the parties involved. And with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog, barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you'd enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.